They thought this would be my humiliation, my own parents dragging me into court over money I didn't even ask for. But when I walked into that courtroom, and the judge froze mid-sentence, recognizing exactly who I was, the entire room shifted. That was the moment my parents realized this wasn't their show anymore. It was mine. The sound of my heels on marble echoed too loudly. Courtrooms have their own kind of silence, the heavy, judgmental kind that tastes like dust and secrets. When I stepped through the doors, my mother rolled her eyes. Not a subtle flicker, but a slow, theatrical roll that screamed, "Here she goes again." My father smirked beside her, tapping his expensive watch like I'd kept them waiting for their performance. But then Judge Marcus Brennan looked up from his papers. His pen stopped. Recognition flickered across his face like lightning surprise. Sorrow, then understanding. He set the pen down, leaned back, and studied me for a long beat. "You're Haley Morrison," he said softly, though it wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Honor." He blinked once, then glanced at my parents. "These allegations are against you?" I saw the confusion ripple through the courtroom. My parents had no idea what just happened, but I did. Judge Brennan had once clerked for my grandfather, Justice William Parker, the man my parents were now accusing me of manipulating. I didn't say a word. I just let that silence hang, heavy as truth. 3 months earlier, the day everything started, the world had smelled of rain and lilies, the scent of loss. My grandfather's funeral filled the cathedral with black robes, polished shoes, and the low murmur of men who'd spent their lives in courtrooms. 40 years on the Supreme Court bench, and now his portrait stared down from the altar, calm, resolute, just as he'd been in life. I delivered the eulogy myself. My voice didn't shake until the very end. Behind me, rows of judges, attorneys, and clerks bowed their heads. In the back, arriving late as always, were Diane and Scott Morrison, my biological parents. They slipped into the last pew, sunglasses still on, whispering to each other while I spoke about the man who'd actually raised me. They left before the reception, of course. Classic Morrison behavior: show up for the photo, vanish before the cleanup. It had been 12 years since I'd last seen them, at my grandmother's funeral. 90 minutes of strained conversation before they disappeared again, leaving me and Grandpa to bury her alone. After that day, it was just the two of us. He was 73 then, still sharp, still teaching, still the center of my universe. And for 15 more years, he kept every promise they broke. My mother used to tell people motherhood cramped her style. She was 18 when she had me barely grown herself, but old enough to know what she was giving up. My father, Scott, was a rising hockey player who loved the spotlight more than responsibility. A baby didn't fit the aesthetic, so they left me at my grandparents' house for a few months. Those months stretched into decades. I remember the day I stopped waiting for them to come back. I was 4, standing on a stool in Grandma Helen's kitchen, stirring cookie dough. She let me pour too many chocolate chips, always too many, and laughed when they overflowed. "Best cookies always have extra love," she said. Grandpa came home in his robes, kissed the top of my head, and told me he'd seen the governor that day. Then he asked about my day like I was the most important witness in the world. That's what love felt like: attention, not apology. Meanwhile, my parents lived their glamorous little lives. Mom sent glossy Christmas cards with palm trees in the background. Dad mailed signed hockey jerseys I never wore. And every year, Grandma taped them to the fridge, as if proof that they existed. When Grandma died suddenly, the house went silent. I was 18, a college freshman, trying to hold together a man who'd spent 60 years loving one woman. We survived by creating new rituals: Sunday dinners, chess at the kitchen table, stories about the law and the meaning of justice. He used to say, "The law should always serve truth, Haley, even when truth hurts." That sentence would one day become my entire creed. After the funeral, I stayed in Grandpa's house, the air still thick with his aftershave and library dust. A week later, the lawyer called. I expected keepsakes: a watch, maybe his books. Instead, he left me everything. The house, the savings, the investments, and a sealed envelope addressed in his deliberate handwriting. "My dearest Haley, you are reading this because I am gone, but my love for you continues. You earned this not through blood, but through presence." Your parents made their choice long ago. This is mine. Be strong, my girl. I cried for hours. Not because of the inheritance, but because someone had finally written down the truth. Then came the second envelope bank statements, showing decades of payments to my parents. Over $800,000 in support, and every message from them asking for more. I knew what would come next even before the lawyer said it. They're likely to contest the will. And they did, claiming I'd manipulated an old man, that Grandpa was senile, that I'd stolen what was rightfully theirs. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't the abandoned little girl anymore. I was a prosecutor who'd spent 10 years dismantling liars in court. And this time, I wasn't fighting for a paycheck. I was fighting for the man who'd saved my life. The day I walked into that courtroom, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. And when Judge Brennan recognized him in me, I knew justice was already leaning my way. They just didn't know it yet. I used to think childhood was supposed to feel like safety. But mine was a series of rooms I waited in, living rooms where my parents never arrived, birthday tables with 2 chairs always empty, phone calls that never came. My grandparents, Helen and William Parker, never once said anything cruel about Diane or Scott. They didn't have to. Their silence was its own kind of truth, the kind that settles in your bones long before you understand it. My earliest memory is of Grandma's hands, soft, flour-dusted, smelling faintly of lavender and vanilla. I must have been 4, perched on a kitchen stool, stirring cookie dough with more enthusiasm than coordination. She laughed when I dumped the whole bag of chocolate chips into the bowl. "Extra love never hurts," she said. That was her rule for everything: plants, people, and cookies. Grandpa would come home in his long black robe, still carrying the day's gravity on his shoulders. But the moment he saw me, that weight lifted. He'd scoop me up, spin me once, and ask, "What's the verdict, counselor?" My answer was always something nonsensical like, "Cookies are done." And he'd grin as if I'd solved a national case. Those nights built the foundation of my life. Warmth, order, unconditional love. 2 people showing up, again and again, even when the world forgot. Diane, on the other hand, showed up twice a year, Christmas, and sometimes my birthday, wearing designer sunglasses indoors, and carrying perfume that made the kitchen smell like expensive guilt. She'd air-kiss the room and sigh, "You've grown," like I'd done it to inconvenience her. Scott usually stayed in the car. When he did come inside, the tension was like a courtroom, mid-verdict, everyone pretending they weren't waiting for an explosion. Grandpa once told me, "Your father confuses pride with presence, and your mother confuses attention with love." At 7, I didn't understand it. By 12, I did. One December stands out more than the rest. It was my school Christmas concert, and I had a tiny solo in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I wore a red sweater Grandma knitted and a paper reindeer headband. I looked for them in the crowd, my parents, I mean. Every time the door opened, my chest lifted with hope. But only Grandpa's video camera light blinked back at me. After the show, Grandma handed me a bouquet of carnations from her garden. I smiled for her, but later, at home, I asked the question that had been bubbling for years. "Why don't they come, Grandma?" She froze, her smile trembling just a little. "They want to, sweetheart. They just can't always make it." I nodded, pretending to believe her. But I'd overheard her on the phone a week before Diane had declined because of Scott's team party. That night, Grandpa sat beside me while I brushed my teeth. He didn't talk about them. He just said quietly, "You deserve people who show up." And he kissed my forehead goodnight. By the time I was 10, I had already built emotional armor without realizing it. When the phone rang, I didn't rush anymore. When packages arrived, shiny boxes with toys or clothes, I'd say thank you and move on. Grandma called them guilt presents. She'd smile sadly and say, "Sweetheart, love doesn't need wrapping paper." At 12, I finally beat Grandpa at chess. He made a big show of it, took my picture with the board, called Grandma to witness the moment. "See that?" he said proudly. "That's strategy and patience paying off." I didn't realize until years later that he wasn't talking about chess. He was teaching me about life. The house they built for me was simple but full of life. The scent of coffee and old books mixed with lavender from Grandma's garden. Sundays were sacred: morning pancakes, afternoon gardening, evening board games. There was no wealth, But there was wealth of another kind, time, attention, laughter echoing through the hallways. And for a long while that was enough. Until the day it wasn't. I was 18 when Grandma died a stroke while tending her tulips. The neighbor found her. Grandpa called me, voice trembling like I'd never heard before. "She's gone, Haley." I drove 6 hours home that night through rain so heavy it blurred everything. When I arrived, he was sitting in the garden in the dark, holding her gloves and staring at the unfinished row of tulips. He didn't cry. Neither did I. We just sat there in silence until dawn. That moment, the two of us alone in a half-dug garden, became the start of a new life. A smaller one. A harder one. But also a deeper one. Diane and Scott attended the funeral. They arrived late, left early, and spent the brief service checking their phones. Not a word of comfort, not a hand on my shoulder. They posed for sympathy, then vanished. When the door closed behind them, Grandpa whispered, "Some people only show up for applause." I remember nodding and realizing I'd never unhear that truth again. From then on, it was just us, the judge and the girl he raised. He made grilled cheese for dinner when neither of us had the energy to cook. I took over Grandma's garden, learning when to prune and when to wait. He taught me how to read people, how to argue with dignity, how to think 3 steps ahead. The law fascinated me, but what fascinated me more was his faith in fairness, in showing up, in doing right, even when no one was watching. I didn't know it then, but that faith would one day be tested in a courtroom filled with the very people who taught me what not to be. And when that day came, I wouldn't flinch. Because by then, I'd already learned the first rule of survival in my family. Love deeply, but never beg for it. When Grandma died, something inside our house went still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. But Grandpa didn't crumble. He simply shifted. He stopped talking about the law like an abstract thing and started talking about it like a duty. And without ever saying it, he passed that duty to me. I took a semester off college to stay with him. We filled the quiet with rituals, Sunday dinners, chess games, old movies. Sometimes we didn't speak for hours, just sat with books open in the same room, breathing the same silence. But every now and then, he'd look up from his legal briefs and ask, "What do you think fairness really means, Haley?" I'd stumble through an answer, and he'd smile slightly, like he was pleased I didn't settle for easy definitions. He never said, "You should be a lawyer." He said, "You already think like one." When I returned to campus, I threw myself into academics. Maybe because studying felt like control, something I could master, when grief made everything else unpredictable. Every good grade, every debate victory, every late-night paper, felt like proof I was worthy of everything he'd given up for me. He came to my graduation front row, tie slightly crooked, proud tears he tried to disguise as allergies. My parents didn't come. They sent a card, no return address. It read, "Proud of you. Love, Mom and Dad." The handwriting wasn't even my mother's. I didn't cry. I just folded it neatly, put it in the back of a drawer, and never opened it again. After college, Grandpa made a few quiet phone calls. I didn't know until later that those calls landed me my first interview at the district attorney's office. When I got the job, I called him in tears. "You pulled strings, didn't you?" He chuckled. "Strings only work if the person on the other end deserves the pull." Those early years as a prosecutor nearly broke me. The long hours, the moral gray zones, the cases that kept me awake at night, domestic abuse, child neglect, corruption. I'd stare at photos of victims and think of Grandma, think of how easily cruelty hides behind polite smiles. Every time I lost faith, Grandpa's voice would echo in my mind. Justice isn't always clean, but it should always be honest. By 30, I'd built a reputation precise, unflinching, uncorruptible. Reporters called me the ice prosecutor. I didn't mind. They didn't know that the ice wasn't coldness, it was control. It was how I survived. Meanwhile, my parents barely existed. Every few years, Diane would send a Christmas text. "Hope you're doing well. Scott says hi." Translation: "We heard you're successful. Do you remember us?" Sometimes Grandpa would mention them gently. "Your mother called," he'd say. I'd shrug. Did she ask about me, or just for money? Usually, he didn't answer. His silence said enough. He still sent them checks every month, $3,000 like clockwork. He said it kept the peace. I said peace built on guilt isn't peace at all. He smiled sadly. You sound more like a judge every day. He retired when I turned 27. 40 years on the bench, an entire generation of lawyers had learned under him. At his retirement dinner, every speech praised his integrity, his compassion, his refusal to bend to politics. When it was my turn to speak, I couldn't find words big enough for what he'd done for me. So I said the simplest truth. You showed me that justice begins at home. He squeezed my hand, eyes shining. You make me proud every single day, Haley. After the applause, he leaned over and whispered, I never wanted you to carry my shadow. I wanted you to build your own. I didn't know then how prophetic that would be. When he stopped working, I noticed him slowing down. His hands shook when pouring coffee. His steps got smaller. But his mind stayed sharp, always reading, always teaching. He'd call me after watching my court appearances on local TV. You paused too long before your rebuttal, he'd tease. Strategic suspense, I'd shoot back. Showmanship, he'd laugh. Those nights became my favorite. The law talk, the gentle ribbing, the smell of grilled cheese and old paper. It was like living in a pocket of safety time couldn't touch. Then one evening, after dinner, he said something that froze me. You know, raising you has been the greatest privilege of my life. I looked up from my coffee, startled. Grandpa. No, let me say it. He was staring at the window, where the garden lights flickered against the glass. Your grandmother and I got to be parents twice, first with Diane, then with you, and we got it right the second time. Tears hit the table before I even realized I was crying. You and Grandma saved me, I whispered. He shook his head. We just loved you. You did the saving. I think part of him knew he was saying goodbye long before I did. He started writing more letters, tidying his study, organizing files. I thought it was habit. Now I know it was preparation. Because 6 months later, he died peacefully in his sleep. I found him in his chair by the window, glasses resting on his chest, a book still open on his lap. On the table beside him was a chessboard, mid-game, my white pawn halfway to promotion. The funeral was enormous. Judges, politicians, students, reporters, everyone came to say goodbye. Everyone except Diane and Scott. They sat in the back again, sunglasses on, arriving late, leaving early. They didn't even come to the reception. They didn't have to. Their absence was louder than any words they could have spoken. A week later, I went to the lawyer's office, expecting memories, a few trinkets, a watch, a book. Instead, he handed me an envelope sealed with Grandpa's old wax stamp. Inside were the words that would start a war. My dearest Haley, you are reading this because I am gone. You earned this not through blood, but through presence. Your parents made their choice long ago. This is mine. Be strong, my girl. And beneath that letter, the documents. Every monthly transfer. Every message from Diane begging for more. Every note from Scott promising to visit and never showing up. A paper trail of 30 years of taking without giving. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. He'd left me everything, the house, the investments, over $3 million. But more than that, he'd left me his trust. And when Diane and Scott filed their lawsuit claiming I'd manipulated him, that he'd been senile, that I'd stolen their rightful inheritance, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Because they had no idea who I'd become. And no idea that I had spent my entire adult life preparing to destroy lies like theirs. There are moments when grief and fury blur together so perfectly, you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. That was me, sitting in Grandpa's study the night after the will, reading his fountain pen still on the desk, his robe draped over the chair, his scent lingering like an echo of safety. He had always been methodical. Even in death, he was precise. The envelope he left behind wasn't just a letter, it was a verdict, one that would change everything. I must have read his words a dozen times, tracing the curve of his handwriting like it was his voice speaking again. You earned this not through blood, but through presence. Presence. The word hit harder every time. Because that's what my parents never understood. Showing up is love's highest form. Under the letter was a second folder, thicker. The lawyer had called it supporting documentation. Inside, Decades of bank statements, emails, even screenshots from Diane's messages. $3,000 a month for 20 years. A total of $820,000. Every line item a record of greed disguised as need. Each message from her was a masterclass in manipulation. Dad, Scott's business is going through a rough patch, just until next month. We'll visit soon, I promise. Haley would love to see us. They never did. The final few transfers were annotated in Grandpa's handwriting. Still no visit. Missed Christmas. Same excuses. He knew. He had always known. When I finished reading, I walked outside into the garden. The air was cold enough to sting, but the tulips were starting to bloom, those same tulips Grandma planted before she died. I crouched down and whispered, "He made sure they can't touch what you built." It wasn't about the money. It was about justice. About acknowledgement. For once, someone had documented the truth. But I underestimated Diane. Within a month, a thick envelope arrived by courier, her lawsuit. Plaintiffs, Diane and Scott Morrison. Defendant, Haley Morrison. Allegation, undue influence, manipulation of a mentally unfit elder. I actually laughed, out loud. Because the irony was poetic, I'd spent 10 years prosecuting financial predators. And now I was being accused of being one. My attorney, Thomas Goldstein, had known Grandpa personally. He looked over the papers, then at me. They're claiming he wasn't of sound mind? Apparently grief made him incompetent. Thomas smirked. The man could quote precedent from 1973 by heart and correct judges on Latin pronunciation. He was sharper than both of them combined. I nodded, but my jaw tightened. They're not after justice, they're after control. They'll lose, Thomas said simply. And you'll get closure. Closure. I wasn't sure I believed in that word anymore. The case moved fast, public interest helped. Grandpa was a legal legend. Every attorney in the city knew his name. The tabloids called it the Judges' Will War. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. And through it all, my parents played their roles perfectly. Diane, the grieving daughter. Scott, the stoic husband standing by her side. They even dressed the part: black suits, somber faces, crocodile tears. I stayed silent. Public statements only feed fire. But in private, I prepared for battle like it was a high-stakes prosecution. I reviewed every document, every message, every line of the will. I knew the facts. I knew the law. And I knew them, their weaknesses, their vanity, their belief that performance could outshine evidence. They'd never learned that truth doesn't need applause. The night before trial, I couldn't sleep. I sat at Grandpa's old desk, staring at a chessboard still set mid-game, the same one we'd played on the week he died. I moved his final piece, whispered, "Checkmate," and felt something loosen in my chest. He'd taught me strategy, patience, how to let opponents trap themselves. Tomorrow, I'd use every lesson he ever gave me. I opened my laptop and started writing notes, reminders, even quotes from his old rulings. But one line stood out, glowing on the screen like prophecy. Character is the only evidence that never lies. That would be my argument. Not about inheritance, not about assets, about character. Who showed up, who didn't. Who loved without conditions, and who only showed up when the money ran out. When dawn came, I dressed in navy, the same color Grandpa wore for his final public appearance. Simple jewelry, no flash. The prosecutor's armor. Thomas met me at the courthouse steps. "You ready?" I took a breath, steady and full. I've been ready for 32 years. Inside, I caught sight of them for the first time in over a decade. Diane looked smaller than I remembered, older, but her eyes still sharp with performative pain. Scott, on the other hand, looked annoyed, as if this whole process was beneath him. Some people never change. Then the bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. "All rise." Judge Marcus Brennan took the bench. He was older too, but I recognized him instantly. Grandpa's old clerk, the man who'd once come to our house for dinner when I was a teenager. And the moment his eyes met mine, I saw it, the flicker of recognition, of memory. He looked at the papers, then back at me. "Wait," he said quietly, setting his pen down. "These allegations are against you?" "Yes, Your Honor." For a heartbeat, the courtroom went still. Then he nodded slowly, as though something had just clicked into place. I didn't know it yet, but that moment would change everything. The battle had officially begun. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't defending myself. I was defending love. The first day of trial smelled like fresh paper and cheap perfume, the scent of people pretending to be innocent. I took my seat at the defendant's table, spine straight, hands folded, expression neutral. Years in prosecution had taught me that silence is a weapon. It makes the liars talk too much. Across the aisle sat Diane and Scott Morrison, my parents, though calling them that still felt foreign in my mouth. Diane wore a black suit that probably cost more than her annual mortgage payment. Her hair was styled into immaculate waves, every strand arranged for sympathy. Scott kept his arm draped behind her chair, like he was posing for a magazine feature titled The Betrayed Couple. Their lawyer, Palmer, was a familiar face, slick, rehearsed, all teeth and charm. I'd seen him lose 3 cases to me before. When our eyes met, he smirked. "Didn't think I'd see you on this side of the room, counselor." "Enjoy it while it lasts," I said quietly. Judge Brennan adjusted his glasses, glancing from them to me. "Counsel, let's begin." Palmer stood first. "Your Honor, this case is not about greed," he began, his tone dripping with irony. "It's about justice. My clients, Diane and Scott Morrison, are here today seeking fairness. Their late father, Judge William Parker, was manipulated during his final years by someone he trusted, someone who exploited his age, his grief, and his vulnerability. He gestured toward me like I was a display piece. This young woman, though she appears calm and capable, used her legal expertise to isolate an elderly man from his family, to turn a loving father against his only daughter." He paused dramatically, letting the murmurs ripple through the room. I didn't flinch. Let them murmur. I'd seen juries react to worse lies. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice for effect. "Your Honor, we have proof that Mr. Parker suffered cognitive decline before his passing, and that Miss Morrison here exerted undue influence over his estate." Theatrical. Predictable. He wasn't arguing facts, he was spinning a story for sympathy. When he sat down, Diane dabbed at imaginary tears with a silk handkerchief. Scott gave a solemn nod, the kind of performance he probably practiced in the mirror. Thomas rose next. His presence was the opposite of Palmer's calm, deliberate, surgical. He began simply, "Your Honor, this case isn't about justice for the plaintiffs. It's about the consequences of abandonment." A murmur cut through the audience, sharp and immediate. Thomas continued, voice steady. "Judge Parker was a man of unmatched intellect until his final breath. We will present medical records confirming he was mentally sound. But more importantly, we will show you letters, financial statements, and years of evidence proving exactly who stood by him and who only called when they needed money." He turned slightly toward Diane. "We will also hear testimony from his closest friends and colleagues. They will confirm that his decision to leave everything to his granddaughter wasn't the result of manipulation, but of gratitude. Gratitude toward the only person who stayed." Then he looked at me. "Haley Morrison's character speaks louder than any accusation." The judge nodded. "We'll begin with the plaintiff's testimony." Diane took the stand first. Even the way she adjusted the microphone was performative. "Mrs. Morrison," Palmer began gently, "can you tell the court about your relationship with your father?" She exhaled shakily. "We were close once. He adored me as a child. But when Haley came along, everything changed. He became distant, controlling. He said he wanted to help raise her, but really, he wanted to keep her." Her voice cracked on cue. "He turned my own daughter against me." I bit the inside of my cheek. Not because it hurt, because it was almost impressive how easily she rewrote history. The jurors watched her like they were at a play. I knew what they saw. A grieving daughter, not a lifelong absentee mother. Then came the question Palmer had been building to. "Did your father ever indicate that he might alter his will?" "Yes," Diane said softly. "After my mother passed, he was never the same. He became confused, paranoid. He once told me, 'You'll get what you deserve, Diane.' I thought it was grief speaking. Now I see. He meant something else." Her performance was flawless. If I hadn't lived it, I might have believed her too. When Thomas cross-examined, his tone didn't rise. It sliced. Mrs. Morrison, how often did you visit your father in the 10 years before his death? She hesitated. We spoke often. That wasn't my question. She blinked. Perhaps a few times a year. Thomas nodded. Court records show no visits in 2014, 2015, or 2016. Phone records show fewer than 5 calls total in that decade. Would you describe that as often? A ripple moved through the spectators. Diane's expression faltered for half a second before she caught herself. I had health issues. Thomas smiled politely. Of course, yet you managed 2 vacations to Italy and 3 appearances at charity galas during that time? Her jaw clenched. He turned, walked a few steps closer. Mrs. Morrison, did your father ever ask you to visit him? Yes, she said tightly. And did you? No. But, no further questions, Thomas said, cutting her off before she could spin another lie. When Scott took the stand, his strategy was simple. Play stoic. Palmer painted him as the loyal husband, the stable presence. But his answers wavered under cross-examination. Mr. Morrison, Thomas said, pacing slowly, did Judge Parker ever provide you with financial assistance? Just small help now and then. Thomas lifted a document. Exhibit 14 wire transfers totaling $820,000 over 20 years. Do you consider that small help? Scott's throat bobbed. It was family support. Interesting, Thomas said mildly. Because I don't see a single repayment or thank you note, only requests for more. The judge's gaze hardened. Even the gallery started to shift uncomfortably. By the time recess was called, Diane's mascara had smudged, and Scott's jaw was locked in silent fury. They avoided looking at me as they left the room. I didn't need them to. Because for the first time in my life, they were finally being seen for who they truly were. Not parents, not victims. Just people who'd mistaken neglect for entitlement. And I was done being their quiet consequence. Tomorrow, it would be my turn to speak. Not as a daughter, not as a defendant, but as the living testimony of the man they betrayed. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. Court wasn't until 9, but sleep felt impossible. I stood in front of the mirror, steadying my breath, fastening the same necklace Grandma gave me at graduation, a small gold tulip pendant. Her favorite flower, her quiet blessing. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about truth. And I wasn't going to whisper it this time. When I entered the courtroom, Diane wouldn't meet my eyes. Scott sat rigid beside her, jaw tight, hands gripping his chair like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Palmer, their lawyer, still carried his usual swagger, but the confidence had cracks now. Judge Brennan took his seat. Let's proceed. Palmer called their final witness, Dr. Evelyn Sloan, a neurologist who claimed Grandpa had shown early signs of dementia. Her testimony was clinical, practiced. He occasionally repeated himself, misplaced papers, forgot appointments. Palmer nodded gravely. Would you say he was of sound mind? She hesitated. Mild cognitive decline may have affected his decision-making capacity. Palmer smiled like a magician revealing a trick. But Thomas stood calmly. Dr. Sloan, when was your last in-person consultation with Judge Parker? 2 years before his passing. 2 years, Thomas repeated, pacing slowly. So you weren't present during the drafting or signing of his will? No. You weren't there when he taught a guest lecture at Harvard Law 5 months before his death? Her eyebrows lifted. He did? Yes. In fact, Thomas continued, handing over a document. This is a transcript of his lecture, 47 minutes. 0 hesitation, 0 errors. Would that level of articulation surprise you in someone with cognitive decline? Dr. Sloan shifted uncomfortably. It's possible he had good days. Thomas nodded. Possible, or perhaps he simply wasn't declining at all. He turned to the judge. No further questions. Diane's mask began to slip. Every time Thomas spoke, her expression twitched a flash of annoyance, a suppressed eye roll. I could almost hear her thoughts. This wasn't supposed to go like this. When the court adjourned for lunch, Palmer whispered furiously to them, his confident grin gone. Diane whispered something back, lips tight, then turned and looked straight at me for the first time in days. There it was, that old glare from childhood, the one that said, "You owe me." But I didn't, not anymore. When we reconvened, Thomas called his first witness, one the plaintiffs clearly hadn't expected. Your Honor, the defense calls Judge Marcus Brennan to the stand. A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. Even Palmer froze. Objection. Overruled, Brennan said dryly. Proceed. A faint smile tugged at Thomas's lips. Thomas faced the bench. Your Honor, before you recuse yourself, may I ask one question for the record? Brennan sighed. Just one. Did you know Judge William Parker personally? I clerked for him early in my career. He mentored me for decades. Would you say he was a man easily manipulated? Brennan's tone hardened. Not a chance. Would you describe him as mentally sharp? Until the end. I attended his final lecture myself. Thomas nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Then he looked at the jury. You've just heard it from the one man in this courtroom who knew both the defendant and the deceased best. Brennan smirked. Mr. Goldstein, I believe I'll step down now before you make me your star witness. The courtroom laughed softly, respectfully. Even the jurors smiled. It wasn't humor. It was momentum shifting. By mid-afternoon, it was my turn. Thomas rested a hand on my shoulder before I stood. You don't need to perform, he said. Just tell the truth. That's what they can't fake. When I took the stand, the air felt heavier. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, reporters, spectators, the people who'd whispered about the judge's greedy granddaughter. But when I looked at Diane, all I saw was the same woman who'd once said I didn't fit her lifestyle. Thomas began gently. Haley, how long did you live with your grandparents? Since I was 2. Did your parents ever take you back into their home? No. Why not? They said they were too busy building their careers. He nodded. And in the 30 years that followed, who raised you? Who paid for your education, your housing, your care? My grandparents. And who visited your grandfather weekly after your grandmother passed? I did. Did your parents? No. He paused, letting the silence settle. Why did Judge Parker leave you his estate? I met the jury's gaze. Because I was there. Because he knew I'd protect what mattered most to him, his work, his legacy, and the home they built together. He wanted peace, not a fight. Thomas stepped back. No further questions. Then came Palmer's turn. He walked toward me like a predator circling prey. Miss Morrison, he said smoothly, you're a prosecutor, correct? Yes. So you're familiar with persuasion, manipulation, emotional leverage. I'm familiar with facts, I said evenly. He smiled. Of course. Did you ever discuss your grandfather's will with him? No. Never? Never. He raised a brow. Interesting, because your bank records show he added you to his account 18 months before his death. That's access, isn't it? It's responsibility, I said. He asked me to help pay his bills when his arthritis worsened. Ah, Palmer paced, voice rising. So you handled his finances, influenced his decisions, and now conveniently inherited everything. Would you call that a coincidence? I didn't blink. I'd call it trust, something my parents never earned. The courtroom went utterly still. Even Palmer froze just long enough for Thomas to stand. Objection. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Brennan said. But the damage was done and not to me. When the session ended, Diane brushed past me in the corridor, her perfume sharp and cold. You think you've won? She hissed. I looked at her not as a daughter, but as a witness under oath. No, I said quietly. I think Grandpa already did. Her lips trembled, not from guilt but fury. She turned away before I could see if she cried. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt done. Done waiting for them to be people they'd never become. Done carrying the shame of being unwanted. Done being quiet. Tomorrow would be verdict day. But in my heart, it already was. The next morning, the city was gray, that heavy, kind of gray that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. I sat in my car outside the courthouse long before the doors opened, watching the rain crawl down the windshield like thin threads of memory. Today wasn't just the verdict. It was the end of a story that started before I could even spell my own name. When I walked into the courtroom, people were already whispering. Reporters lined the back rows. Cameras flashed as if justice were some red carpet event. Diane was there, of course. Perfect posture, immaculate hair, makeup soft enough to scream, "Victim." Scott looked half asleep, or maybe hungover. And Palmer, well, Palmer had that particular confidence. Only men who are about to lose still manage to wear. I didn't look at any of them. I looked at Judge Brennan. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, like he understood exactly what this day meant. "Miss Morrison," Thomas said as the court came to order, "you remain under oath." He turned toward the judge. "Before we rest, my client would like to make a final statement." Permission was granted. I stood. And the world, for a brief second, went silent. "My grandfather," I began, my voice steady but low, "was the kind of man who believed character was louder than reputation. He used to say, 'The law isn't about punishment, it's about reflection. It shows us who we really are.'" I took a breath. "This trial isn't about money. It's about what we choose to remember, and what we pretend to forget." I turned slightly toward Diane and Scott. "When I was 2, you left me with them because it was inconvenient to raise me. You told people it was temporary. 30 years later, I'm still waiting for temporary to end." Diane's face twitched her first real crack. I kept going. "You visited twice a year, sometimes less. You called when you needed money, not when you missed me. Grandpa knew. He always knew. But he didn't stop loving you, he just stopped expecting you." I paused, scanning the room, the jurors leaning forward, the journalists scribbling. "He raised me to believe that love was a verb. It means showing up. And you didn't, not once when it mattered." I let the silence hang until it felt like it was breathing on its own. "When he died, he left me his estate. Not because I'm his granddaughter, but because I was there. Because he trusted that I wouldn't sell the house where Grandma's tulips still bloom. Because he knew I'd protect what you abandoned." I looked down briefly, then back up. "I don't need his money, I never did. But I will protect his name from anyone who tries to twist it for their convenience." I turned to the judge, then the jury. "You don't have to take my word for it. Take his handwriting, his letters, his careful documentation. Every action he took proves one thing. He wasn't manipulated. He was finally setting things right." My voice softened. "My name is Haley Morrison. And I am proud to have been raised by William and Helen Parker, the only real parents I ever had." When I sat down, Thomas didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The entire room had already shifted. Palmer tried to regain footing with a limp objection, something about emotional manipulation of the court. Judge Brennan simply replied, "Overruled." Then he looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw it. The same expression Grandpa used to wear when I solved a hard problem as a child. Pride mixed with peace. He called for a brief recess before closing arguments. Diane stayed seated. Her face was pale, her mascara cracking under the lights. Scott stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched like a man trying to chew on regret. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt free. Like I had finally exhaled after a lifetime of holding it in. When the recess ended, the final words were formalities. Palmer repeated his rehearsed lines about familial duty and fairness. Thomas simply said, "Your Honor, truth doesn't need rehearsal." And then it was done. The jury left to deliberate. Minutes stretched into hours. I waited in the hallway outside, watching the rain slide down the courthouse windows. Thomas handed me a cup of coffee I didn't drink. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you already won where it matters." I nodded. But in truth, there was still one thing I needed: not money, not victory. Validation. That he'd been seen, understood, remembered the way he deserved. That was the only verdict I cared about. When the doors opened again, the courtroom filled quickly. The jury filed in. No one spoke. Brennan cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson nodded. "We have, Your Honor." He handed the paper over. Brennan unfolded it slowly, read it once, then looked up. "On the matter of Morrison versus Morrison, the court finds in favor of the defendant." The sound that followed wasn't noise, it was air rushing out of a story that had been suffocating for decades. Reporters scribbled, cameras clicked, whispers spread like wildfire. Diane gasped. Scott muttered something under his breath. Palmer lowered his head, defeated. I didn't move. I just closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa." When I opened them again, Diane was standing, shaking, mascara running. "Do you feel good about this?" she snapped, her voice cracking. "About destroying your family?" I met her eyes calmly. "I didn't destroy it. You abandoned it. I just stopped pretending you didn't." Her mouth opened, then closed again, no words coming out. Scott placed a hand on her arm, guiding her away. But for the first time in my life, she didn't pull free. Maybe because there was nothing left to fight for. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Brennan stepped down from the bench. He stopped beside me, resting a hand gently on my shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said quietly. I smiled faintly. "I just hope he'd say I argued well." Brennan chuckled. "He'd say you didn't need to." Outside, the rain had stopped. The world smelled like wet earth and renewal. I stood on the courthouse steps, the crowd thinning around me, and let the breeze carry away the last remnants of bitterness. For the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Tomorrow, there would be press. There would be gossip. But today, there was peace. And peace, I realized, was the rarest kind of justice. The courthouse emptied fast, reporters chasing quotes, lawyers shaking hands, spectators already moving on to their next story. But I stayed seated a moment longer, listening to the faint echo of footsteps fade down the marble corridor. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of release. For 30 years, I had been carrying a truth no one wanted to hear. Now, finally, it had been spoken under oath, in public, and recorded forever. Thomas packed up the files beside me, smiling quietly. "You did good, kid." I huffed a breath that might have been a laugh. "You sound like him." "Good," Thomas said. "Means I'm doing something right." He handed me a tissue, nodded toward the press waiting outside. "You want to say anything to them?" "No," I said, slipping the tissue into my pocket. "I already said everything that mattered." When I stepped out into the hallway, the fluorescent lights felt harsh after the courtroom's calm. Diane was standing by the window at the end of the hall, arms crossed, staring at nothing. Scott was beside her, pacing, phone pressed to his ear. For a second, I thought they'd leave without a word. Then she turned. "Haley." Just my name. No venom this time. No performance. Just exhaustion. I walked closer, slow, steady. "Mom." The word felt foreign, like trying on a dress that never fit. She didn't meet my eyes. "You think you've won something here?" "I didn't win," I said quietly. "I defended the man who raised me." She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You think he was perfect? He ruined our family." "No," I said. "He saved what was left of it." That landed. I could see it, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her jaw twitched. For the first time, she looked small. She stepped closer. "You humiliated me in front of the entire city." I shook my head. "You did that yourself. I just stopped cleaning up after you." Scott hung up his phone and turned toward us. "You could have just given us something," he snapped. I met his gaze. "He gave you 30 years of something. You spent it all." He exhaled hard through his nose, muttered a curse, and started down the hall. Diane stayed still, watching me. Her eyes were glossy, not from tears, but from disbelief. Like she'd finally realized that I wasn't the quiet little girl waiting at the window anymore. "Haley," she said softly, almost pleading, "I'm still your mother." The words hung between us, fragile and trembling. I thought about every missed birthday, every "will come next time," every time Grandma lied for her just to protect me from disappointment. And I realized that biology wasn't an anchor, it was just a blueprint. What you build from it is what counts. I met her eyes. "You were supposed to be." She flinched. Then she nodded, just once, and turned away. Her heels clicked down the hallway, sharp, steady, fading. Outside, the air was cold, the sky clearing to that silver blue that comes after rain. The reporters swarmed, microphones raised, voices blending into static. "Miss Morrison, any comment? Do you plan to reconcile with your family? Will you appeal for damages?" I didn't answer any of them. I just smiled politely, stepped through the crowd, and kept walking until the voices faded behind me. At the courthouse steps, I paused. Thomas joined me, hands in his coat pockets. "They'll come around," he said gently. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe that chapter's just closed." He nodded. "Closure doesn't mean reunion." I drove straight to the cemetery. The sun was setting when I got there, soft gold spilling across the headstones. I knelt in front of the Parker grave, brushing a fallen leaf from Grandma's name. The tulips I planted weeks ago had bloomed early, stubborn and bright, just like her. I set the court document on the grass, weighed down by a small stone. "Verdict, in favor of the defendant," I whispered, smiling faintly. "We did it." A breeze swept through the trees, stirring the petals. For a moment, it felt like an answer. Not words, but presence. The same kind Grandpa had promised in his letter, the kind that never really leaves. By the time I left, the sky had deepened into violet. I walked back to the car, feeling lighter than I had in years. For once, I didn't feel like someone's daughter or someone's defense. I just felt like Haley, the woman who finally stopped apologizing for surviving. As I drove away, city lights flickered in the distance. Behind me lay silence, peace, and a grave covered in tulips. Ahead of me lay whatever came next. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it, because I'd already faced my past and won without revenge. A month passed. Then another. The world moved on. The news cycle replaced. The judges will war, with newer scandals, fresher outrage. But I stayed in the quiet. The kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from finally running out of things to defend. The lawsuit was over. The estate was settled. The house was officially mine, though I never really thought of it that way. It was still ours. Grandpa's study remained exactly as he left it. Law books lined like soldiers, a chessboard mid-game, and that faint smell of cedar and coffee that made it feel like he'd just stepped out for a moment. I couldn't bring myself to move a single thing. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like memory. It was a Thursday afternoon when the doorbell rang. An older woman stood there, hair silver, cardigan buttoned wrong, clutching a small box wrapped in twine. "Are you Miss Morrison?" "Yes." She smiled faintly. "My name's Patricia Caldwell. I was your grandfather's neighbor, lived across the street for 30 years. I opened the door wider. "Please, come in." She hesitated, eyes scanning the familiar entryway. "He used to bring me tulips every spring. Said they were your grandmother's favorite." "They were," I said softly. She handed me the box. "I found these when I cleaned out my attic last week. Letters he asked me to hold on to, said he'd collect them if he changed his mind. He never did." My heart stumbled. "Letters?" She nodded. "He said they were too heavy to keep in the house." I thanked her, closed the door, and set the box on the table. The twine was brittle, the lid yellowed with time. Inside were 6 envelopes, each labeled in his unmistakable handwriting. To Diane, not sent. I sat down. For a long time, I just stared at them. Part of me wanted to burn them unopened to leave the past where it belonged. But curiosity is a cruel thing when love is involved. So I opened the first one. "Dear Diane, I keep telling myself you'll come visit next month. I make your favorite lemon pie every Sunday, just in case. Haley helps. She still asks why you don't stay for dinner. I tell her you're busy, because it hurts less than saying you've chosen not to come." The second letter came 6 months later. "Dear Diane, I sent you money again. I'm not angry. I just wish it came with a phone call. Haley's growing fast, you'd be proud of her. You'd also see yourself in her eyes if you looked long enough." By the third, his handwriting had grown shakier. "You told me once that being a mother wasn't your gift. Maybe that's true. But I hope someday you understand that love is a skill. You can learn it, if you want to." I stopped halfway through the fourth, tears blurring the ink. The letters weren't angry. They weren't even bitter. They were full of longing. A father trying to forgive a daughter who kept failing him. I read the final one last. It was dated 6 months before he died. "Dear Diane, if you're reading this, I probably didn't send it. I've made my decision about the will, not out of resentment, but clarity. I know what it's like to love someone who never returns the favor. I hope one day you realize that Haley's not your rival. She's your second chance. Use it or you'll lose it. The words hit like thunder, not for me, but for her. Because I finally understood what he'd been trying to do all along. He wasn't punishing her. He was giving her one last test. And she failed it publicly, spectacularly, completely. That night, I walked down to the garden. The tulips had begun to wilt, petals curling inward like secrets. I sat in the grass with the letters spread beside me, the paper catching moonlight. "Why did you keep trying?" I whispered. "Maybe because love, real love, never stops trying, even when it should." I thought about sending the letters to Diane. But then I imagined her reaction, the same excuses, the same deflection, the same performance. No, these weren't for her anymore. They were for me, proof that even the most principled man I'd ever known still believed in redemption. And maybe, someday, I could too. The next morning, I took the letters to his study and slid them into a new envelope labeled Unsent Truths. Then I placed it in the drawer beside his gavel and closed it gently. When I turned around, the sunlight had filled the room completely warm, golden, alive. For the first time since his death, the house didn't feel empty. It felt still occupied. Maybe not by him exactly, but by everything he'd taught me: patience, integrity, and the courage to face even the ugliest truths without flinching. I looked up at his portrait on the wall. "I found your letters," I said softly. "And I understand now. You weren't just teaching me how to fight for justice. You were teaching me how to forgive." The air in the room shifted, the quiet kind of shift that feels like someone just walked past. And for the first time, I smiled without sadness. Because I finally knew. He was still here. Just differently. 6 months after the verdict, life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost foreign in its quietness. No lawyers, no cameras, no late-night calls from Thomas with urgent filings. Just work, gym, quiet dinners, and long walks through the park where Grandpa used to push me on the swings. Peace, I was learning, could be uncomfortable when you'd spent your whole life fighting. But I didn't realize how much of that fight had shaped me until one morning, my phone rang, and the governor's office was on the line. "Miss Morrison, we'd like to discuss your record as a prosecutor." My first thought was, what did I do wrong? Old habits die hard. Then the woman laughed. "Don't worry, it's good news. The State Judicial Committee is considering you for a bench appointment." "A judgeship?" "Yes, preliminary interviews next week." I hung up and sat there in stunned silence. For most people, becoming a judge was a dream after decades in the courtroom. For me, it felt like destiny calling from the other side of grief. I glanced at Grandpa's photograph on my desk. He was wearing his robe, eyes serious, hand resting on a chessboard mid-game. "You planned this, didn't you?" I whispered. The interview process was grueling: background checks, hearings, ethics reviews, media scrutiny, and of course, someone eventually brought up the lawsuit. "Miss Morrison," a senator asked during the confirmation hearing, "you were the defendant in a case brought by your own parents. Some worry that this reflects a lack of family values." I met his eyes steadily. "With respect, Senator, I think it reflects exactly the opposite. Family values aren't about pretending blood means loyalty. They're about showing up. My grandparents showed up for me when my parents didn't. They taught me that love is measured by consistency, not convenience. That's the principle I live by, and the one I'll uphold from the bench." Silence followed, heavy, thoughtful silence. Then one senator nodded slowly. Another smiled. That's when I knew. I'd just won. The appointment went through 2 months later. Judge Haley Morrison. Age 33. One of the youngest in the state's history. On my first day, the court clerk handed me my robe. It wasn't new. It was his. "We found it in storage," she said. "Thought you might want to wear it for your investiture." The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. When I slipped it on, it was too big through the shoulders, but perfect everywhere else. It didn't feel like I was stepping into his shadow. It felt like I was walking beside him again. My first case was a custody dispute, 2 parents fighting over a 5-year-old girl. Both crying, both angry, both convinced they were the hero. When they finished their opening statements, I sat back and looked at the child sitting between them, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Her eyes reminded me of mine at that age, watching adults use love like a weapon. When I delivered my ruling, I spoke softly but clearly. This child deserves parents who show up. Not parents who win arguments. Not parents who make promises they never keep. Children remember who was there. They remember love and action. I'm ordering joint custody with mandatory counseling to ensure this child sees more cooperation than conflict. The mother cried. The father nodded. And when the gavel fell, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't just defending justice. I was delivering it. Months turned into years. Word spread quickly. Judge Morrison was firm but fair. She didn't tolerate manipulation. She valued presence over performance. And when she spoke about family, it wasn't theory, it was testimony. I took on the cases no one wanted: abuse, inheritance, guardianship. I saw reflections of myself in so many children, so many caretakers who loved in silence while others claimed the title of parent. Each ruling became a quiet vow to Grandpa. I'll keep doing what you taught me. I'll keep protecting the people who show up. 3 years later, I got another call. A promotion. An appointment to the Supreme Court of our state. When I walked into the marble building for the first time, I froze. The walls were lined with portraits of past justices. And there he was, Judge William Parker. My grandfather. The man whose lessons built my life. I reached out and touched the edge of the frame. You see, Grandpa? I whispered. I didn't just inherit your money, I inherited your mission. The first opinion I wrote as Justice Morrison was about parental rights. The case involved a mother who'd abandoned her child for years, then returned when she realized the child's guardian had inherited family property. I didn't have to imagine how that felt. I'd lived it. My ruling began. Parental rights are not birthrights. They are responsibilities, earned through action. Love that appears only when inheritance is at stake is not love, it is strategy. And this court will not reward absence disguised as regret. The decision went viral. Some called it cold. Others called it revolutionary. But to me, it was simply honest. Because family, I had learned, isn't defined by DNA. It's defined by who stays when it's hard. After that, my work took on a life of its own. Judges began citing Morrison v. Morrison as precedent in estate cases across the country. Students studied it in law schools. People wrote letters, grandchildren, stepchildren, foster parents thanking me for giving their kind of love legal recognition. And every spring, I planted tulips around the courthouse steps. Red and yellow, the same mix Grandma used to grow. They became my quiet rebellion against cynicism. A reminder that love, like tulips, always returns if you keep planting it. One afternoon, as I locked my chambers for the day, a young attorney stopped me in the hallway. Justice Morrison? Yes? I just wanted to say, my grandmother raised me. Your ruling helped her keep custody when my parents tried to take me back for the inheritance. Thank you. Her eyes were bright, trembling. And in that moment, I saw my own story reflected in hers. I smiled. Don't thank me. Thank the people who showed up for you. Always protect them. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. As she walked away, I looked up toward the skylight, sunlight pouring through in gold ribbons. It felt like a benediction. Like Grandpa's hand on my shoulder again, steady, proud. That night, I sat in my chambers and whispered into the stillness, Grandpa, we did it. And I swear, somewhere in that quiet I could hear him answer, you always would. Years rolled by quietly after that: cases, conferences, late nights in chambers, with files spread across the desk, and tulips blooming outside the courthouse every spring. People began calling me the heart of the bench. It made me smile, because Grandpa used to say, justice without heart is just paperwork. By my late 40s, I had written over 200 opinions. Some changed laws. Some changed lives. But every one of them, in some way, carried his voice in mine. And then, one morning, an envelope arrived at my office. Cream paper. Elegant cursive. From the State Judicial Committee. I opened it, and the first line made me pause. We are honored to inform you that the new State Supreme Court building will be renamed the William Parker Justice Center. My breath caught. I had to read it twice to believe it. The man who taught me the meaning of justice was about to have his name etched in stone. Permanently. The dedication ceremony was scheduled for spring tulip season. Fitting, I thought. The morning of, I stood before the mirror fastening the same pearl earrings Grandma gave me for law school graduation. Simple, honest, enduring. Like her. At the courthouse, the air buzzed with anticipation. Judges, governors, clerks, students all gathered under banners that read, "The William Parker Justice Center." I walked to the podium, my heart thudding like a drum. When the applause faded, I began. My grandfather wasn't just a judge. He was the kind of man who believed showing up was the purest form of love. I looked out at the sea of faces, lawyers, clerks, journalists, families. He could have retired early, could have left the system when it started to grind him down. But he stayed because he believed in something bigger than himself. And when his daughter left her child behind, he didn't hesitate. He showed up again. For me. My voice cracked slightly, but I didn't stop. He taught me that justice starts at home by doing right even when no one's watching. That love isn't inherited. It's demonstrated. That the most important verdict you'll ever face is the one you deliver on your own character. I smiled, blinking back tears. And if he were here today, I think he'd say, "About time they gave me a decent office." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Then applause. Thunderous, endless applause. As they unveiled the plaque, sunlight spilled over the engraved letters, "William Parker Justice Center." And for one fleeting second, I swore I saw him standing beside me, smiling that quiet, proud smile that always said, "You did well, kid." That evening, after the crowd dispersed, I stayed behind. The marble halls were silent now, filled only with the faint echo of my footsteps. I traced my fingers over his name on the plaque. Cold metal. Warm memory. "We made it, Grandpa," I whispered. "You're home again." Outside, tulips lined the walkway in perfect symmetry. Red for love, yellow for gratitude. The same colors I'd planted at his grave 20 years earlier. I took a seat on the courthouse steps, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in his shadow. I was part of his legacy now, an extension of everything he built. A few years later, when I turned 60, the press started whispering about retirement. "You've shaped the court, Justice Morrison. Don't you think you've earned a rest?" Maybe I had. But every time I thought of leaving, I'd hear his voice again. "Justice isn't a job, Haley. It's a duty. You stop when you've given everything you have." So I stayed until the day I realized I finally had. I announced my retirement on the anniversary of his death. 30 years to the day. Full circle. At the press conference, a reporter shouted, "Any regrets, Justice Morrison?" I smiled softly. None. I lived by the principles I was raised with. I showed up. I stood for truth. And I loved the people who deserved to be loved. That's all anyone can do. I amly proved it way. On my last morning in chambers, the clerks surprised me with a gift. A framed photo. Me, Grandpa and Grandma at my 8th birthday party. Frosting on our faces, tulips in the background, laughter frozen in time. Below it, they'd engraved a quote from one of my own rulings. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who shows up when it matters most. I stood there for a long time, tears stinging my eyes. That was the legacy. Not the verdicts. Not the honors. Not the robe. But the lesson. That afternoon, I visited the cemetery one last time before leaving the city. The tulips were in bloom, as they always were. I sat beside their graves, the sun warm on my face. "You were right," I said quietly. "Love endures. And so does truth." I placed my resignation letter at the base of the headstones. It wasn't an ending. It was a graduation. When I finally stood to leave, the wind rustled through the trees. Soft, familiar, comforting. I smiled. Because I knew exactly what it meant. They were still with me. Always had been. Always would be. That night, before bed, I took out Grandpa's old letter, the one he left me with his will. The paper had yellowed with age, the ink fading, but the words were still clear. "You earned this, Haley. Not because you're my granddaughter, but because you showed up." I placed the letter back in its envelope, turned off the lamp, and whispered into the quiet, "I did, Grandpa, every single day." The room filled with moonlight. And for the first time in a lifetime, I didn't dream of loss. I dreamed of tulips, blooming endlessly, year after year, just like love.